When you discover that your enterprise has been breached or has been a victim of cybercrime, your initial thoughts go to solving the immediate problem. But for true cyber professionals, that's only the beginning. It is important for cybersecurity professionals to undergo a thorough process of identifying, preserving, analyzing, and presenting digital evidence. This process is known as digital forensics. Since the 1970s, the field of digital forensics has evolved to keep up with the widespread adoption of technology and the means in which these technologies are used for criminal activity. The use of computers for financial crimes in the 1980s helped shape digital forensic methods into what they are today. With the advent of modern computing, a new landscape for criminal activity has emerged. The need to gather new forms of evidence turned digital forensics into a vital tool used by law enforcement in the pursuit and conviction of crimes, both computer-based, such as human exploitation, cyberstalking, and cyber terrorism, but also computer-facilitated, such as illegal data breaches that result in the theft of information. To support this new discipline, specialized tools have also emerged to assist investigators in the capture, analysis, and preservation of evidence that might arise during the course of investigating that criminal activity. Any part of an enterprise system can be vulnerable to criminal activity, data theft, or unauthorized penetration. Forensic analysts must make sure to analyze storage media, hardware and operating systems, networks, and applications to locate the point of compromise. The mission criticality of the compromised application, system, or network determines the level of investigation. When conducting a forensic investigation, it is important to follow the digital forensic scientific process. This 8-step process covers the entire evidence gathering procedure, from data collection to examination and analysis to reporting. In the data collection phase, investigators obtain search authority, document the chain of custody, and hash and duplicate all evidence. In the examination and analysis phase, investigators validate their tools, perform analysis, and reproduce those methods and outcomes for assurance. The reporting phase is when conclusions are made and expert evidence or testimony is presented. Since investigators may be required to present evidence as part of expert testimony, using this scientific process increases the likelihood that any evidence found will be fully admissible in a court of law. Another important consideration for organizations, should they be the victim of a breach, is the possible mishandling of evidence by untrained staff. To mitigate this risk, an organization's evidence preservation considerations could involve bringing in either law enforcement or an external forensic specialist, should legal remedies such as criminal prosecution of the perpetrator be considered. Computer systems, networks, and mobile devices can all be utilized in or fall victim to a cyber attack. Each device type has different intrusion methods and requirements for evidence handling. This has led to the formation of 3 distinct branches of digital forensics. Computer forensics may rely on the need to create a disk image to preserve evidence, or virtual drives may be used to emulate an entire machine. Network forensics focuses on the monitoring and analyzing of computer network traffic. Mobile devices present their own unique challenges, due in part to memory volatility, as low-power DRAM used in smartphones can lose data when powered off. Thus, proper handling procedures and adherence to the documented chain of custody must be followed to protect and preserve such evidence. Regardless of where an attack occurs, the enterprise cybersecurity program should have policies that address all forensics considerations, such as contacting law enforcement, monitoring, and conducting regular reviews of forensic policies, guidelines, and procedures. This should take into account the need to preserve and maintain evidence, as well as other requirements such as accreditation. For example, in situations where cardholder data is involved, as well as the decision to involve outside specialists. When you discover that your enterprise has been breached, digital forensics can ensure that best practices are observed throughout the evidence gathering process. Without digital forensics, evidence can go unnoticed or become compromised, and systems may remain vulnerable to additional attacks. As cybercriminals get more sophisticated and data breaches become more damaging to enterprises, Digital forensics and the digital forensics scientific process will continue to provide a means to bring cyber criminals to justice in our increasingly complex and fast-moving technological.
So, you wonder if your wife is cheating on you, your daughter is taken by a lover boy, or your employee is committing fraud. You have a phone containing deleted text and WhatsApp messages. Now you wonder how to extract evidence from this phone. So you start surfing the internet, find some do-it-yourself tools, and with a little luck, you find a trace, unaware of what evidence you might destroy. Don't mess with evidence. Contact the investigators at mobileforensics.eu. They analyze the phone with forensic equipment and present the results back to you in a clear report.
Data off of a cell phone, and I have actually stolen Steve Scott's cell phone to do this. Let's see exactly what he has on there. Here we have the various cables that we use to connect the cell phone to this hardware. We have different manufacturers. We have Kyocera, we have Sanyo, we have Motorola, LG. All of these various manufacturers are supported by this manufacturer, and we can actually pull information off of all of these cell phones just by using these various cables. Okay, what we have here is we have a cell phone analyzer. It's actually called the UFED. It's built by Cellbrite. And what we actually are going to do is use this phone right here. We're going to connect it up to the source to this, and it is going to analyze the data that's actually on the memory on this cell phone. And then it will transmit it through this cable to this computer over here. And what we'll actually get is we will actually receive all of the various text messages, pictures, all of that data will be on this screen up here. Okay, up here we have the actual data that has been recovered from this cell phone, and it's been output into this report manager. And as you can see, we have a lot of various texts that have been recovered, and we can actually see them, who they're to. Of course, I've got some of these actually covered up so that we don't display who they are. Again, we have images here, we've got various pictures and their thumbnails. As you can see right here, this one is someone's family right there, and there are various pictures that you can actually see. And we recovered all of these just from this cell phone right here using this hardware.
Hey everyone, Joe Grand here in a hotel room in an undisclosed location, bringing you a demonstration of extracting firmware through a JTAG interface. My target board for this demonstration is a Linksys WRT54G. These things have been around for a long time, super hackable, lots of information about them online. You can get them pretty cheap at thrift stores and on eBay. These are really a great platform to start working with if you're interested in learning about hardware hacking and exploring different types of embedded systems. So JTAG is an industry standard interface that really was designed for low-level chip testing. Nowadays, when we think of JTAG, we think of device programming, debugging, But it didn't start that way, and vendors over time have added functionality. I've given talks about JTAG in the past, so you can find some of those videos on YouTube. But today what we're going to be doing is using JTAG over a tool called the Bus Blaster to connect to the JTAG interface of our target. That's going to communicate with the CPU, and then the CPU will communicate for us to the memory, and then we'll be able to extract the contents. So what we have set up here is our target board. We have our JTAG connector down here, and there's ground on one side and the signals on the other. So I wired those directly up to the Bus Blaster. On the Bus Blaster, on the silk screen, there's actually the signal names right on here. So you just have to make sure you run the cables to the right spots here. And then the Bus Blaster is connected and controlled over USB. That goes to my host computer. Everything else is done in software. So the first thing we need to do is run the UR-JTAG tool. And I already have that pre-installed on my machine, so I can just type JTAG and it's going to load up. So what we need to do to get our hardware set up is we're going to define the JTAG hardware that we're using. So we're going to type cable, JTAG key, put a vendor ID of 0403 and a product ID of 6010. This vendor ID and product ID and the JTAG key is basically a general purpose JTAG hardware based on an FTDI FT2232 USB to serial adapter. So the Bus Blaster that we're using is essentially the same as the JTAG key. We're going to specify interface 0, which is one of the two interfaces for the FT232H. All right, we see connected to lib FTDI driver. So now we're good to go. What we can do is actually type detect now, and we're going to look out. The Bus Blaster is going to try to communicate over JTAG on the pins that we've connected on those signals and query the JTAG chain and see if it can detect any devices. And here we go. So we can actually see the device ID that was returned by the chip, 1471217F. And UR-JTAG even parses that out and tells us, okay, it's manufacturer of Broadcom BCM4712 chip, which is pretty handy. So now what we can do, now that we've detected the device on the chain, this Broadcom chip, the BCM4712, is a MIPS architecture. And there's some additional functionality for MIPS called eJTAG, which stands for Enhanced JTAG. And what that is basically debugging and programming functionality built on top of the JTAG specification. Because JTAG itself doesn't define any high-level kind of functionality commands, but for MIPS, this Enhanced JTAG is part of that architecture. And UR-JTAG supports that. So we can just tell UR-JTAG to initialize the eJTAG functionality of the chip we're connected to. And right away we get a response back and we see processor entered debug mode. So now we're communicating through UR-JTAG to the Bus Blaster, to the WRT54G, to the Broadcom CPU, and now we're actually in a debug mode, which is pretty cool. Now, if you're dealing with another type of architecture or some other type of target chip, this particular command might not work, this particular process as a whole might not work. What we can do now is take advantage of another command within UR-JTAG called detect flash, and that's going to query the CPU and basically twiddle the bits of the CPU through JTAG and reach out and see if it can detect any external memory connected to it. So we're going to type in our base address here of 3C000000. And this base address, you need to tell the command where to start looking for the memory. And this is something that I had discovered through looking at the UART output, the boot log information as this router was booting up. The base address that it actually printed in the UART output was 1C000000. So I did a little bit of kind of guessing. If for some reason you don't know the base address, if you can't get any other clues, you might have to do some brute forcing until you actually get the correct response back from the tool. So let's see if we can detect the attached memory. We see a whole bunch of information coming back. This is part of the CFI specification, the Common Flash Interface. And this information that's coming back is actually stored on the chip, on the memory device, and sent back to us. So we can see some of the low-level kind of configuration stuff. We see our device size, so it's a 4 megabyte flash. And that makes sense because the device on this Linksys board is an Intel flash. It's a 28F320, and a bunch of other information. So now that we can actually communicate to the memory device, we can just try to read the memory. So we're going to type in the readmem command with our base address, and let's go for the whole enchilada all at once. 400,000 hex, that's 4 megabytes. Save that to a file, dump.bin, and give that a go.
All right, so that dump took just a little bit under 5 hours, and extraction over JTAG is generally relatively slow compared to other methods because we're communicating to the target device serially, and there's just a lot of information that needs to be transferred, and we're basically just shifting data in and shifting data out per the JTAG spec. Usually though, if we're extracting memory in this way, time is not of the essence, so we just wait for it to take as long as it needs to take. One of the first things that I'll do once I successfully extract a binary blob is to run strings on it. Strings is going to show us all of the printable ASCII text that's within that binary blob. And you can see there's all sorts of information in here in the clear, stored in the memory. Things like passwords, names of access points, there's mine, Joe Grand, WRT54G, and lots of information in there that you don't even really have to do any sort of complex reverse engineering to get information about the target. Another tool we can use is Binwalk, which is going to look for known signatures and known headers of things like file systems and zip files and image files, and it really makes it a lot easier for us to take a large binary dump. Like in our case, 4 megabytes is really big and not something that we would generally just start reverse engineering without knowing what we're looking at. So Binwalk is really going to give us a clue about what's actually contained within that binary.
Once you've successfully extracted firmware from the memory, then your hardware problem basically becomes a software problem. There are lots of great people doing some amazing firmware reverse engineering and exploitation that you can learn from. Take a look at the exploiteers who do a lot of crazy consumer electronics hacking. Chris Eagle is the IDA Pro master. Azeria doing a whole bunch of ARM exploitation. And Craig Hefner, who does a lot of routers and network types of devices.
Hi Alan. Okay, I'll show you. Here's the final on the machine. So I'll show you what I've done here. First of all, this is a gauge here that tells you the voltage of the light so that you can regulate the light. Then up here I've added, instead of using a computer to monitor the temperature, I put this gauge up here now so that we can monitor the temperature gauge directly. And then I made a bracket that goes across the front here that holds a glass to shield so you can look at it. We'll make the glass a little bit bigger, but I haven't done that yet. So I'll show you how it works here. So if you want to heat the plate down on the bottom, you turn it on, and then if you flip the switch over, you can turn it up. Obviously it'll go to 120 volts, but if I put it on about 80, you can see that the temperature is starting to go up, so you can monitor the temperature. I don't have a cell phone on there now, but you can see 105, 107, and it'll go up, and that's heating from the bottom. Okay, then once the bottom gets all heated up, you can flip this over here, turn on the lamp, and you can heat up the lamp. I'll put the glass in there so
So first things first, we got our micro SD card. The backside has the interface. That's what we're going to be working with. The interface has 2 pins that are slightly taller than the rest. It can be very easily spotted if you just look closer. So that's your VCC and VSS contact pads. If you have access to multimeter, great. Set it up to continuity test. Put one probe on one end and another probe on another end. If it displays a number and doesn't make a beep, you're good to go. That means the controller is not shorted out and this card is not going to begin overheating if we put power to it. So I begin the process by putting 3M tape in a field of view of my microscope. It's a double-sided tape that will hold the unit in place. The reason why I need it to be held in place is because we're gonna apply, we're gonna sand it a little bit. Now obviously use high grit sandpaper. I use 800 because I'm comfortable with it, but you can go higher. I mean, especially if you haven't done it before, I would recommend you start higher, especially if it's like your first project or something. And take a little bit of a time. Don't burn through the card for extensive periods of time, because you will damage the circuit board most likely. And if that happens, then you can forget about the recovery altogether. Now, what I'll do here is I'll just little by little, by monitoring it through the microscope, I'll be scratching the surface of this device, and eventually that will expose the printed circuitry underneath the layer of acrylic, plastic, or paint, or whatever that surface is covered with. We need to expose that. So I'm gonna put this on fast forward, because it did take me quite a bit of time. But eventually you'll see a design coming through that paint. Now, once we burn through the entire mask, we'll be able to begin the soldering procedure. So we're almost there now. And for the last part, I just want to make sure like you guys understand this. We don't need to expose the whole back of that unit. We need to just expose the pads that we're going to be soldering wires to, because everything else is going to be basically untouched. So up here, what I do, once I get the mask thin enough, I fold my sandpaper to make it almost like a little sanding block. And in the microscope, it's very easy to see that it's gonna be like a sanding block, and it's very easy to control and not go over the edges. Edges are most vulnerable spots, because they will be taking the most amount of contact, I'm guessing. So by folding it in small pieces like this, we can concentrate on the center of the card only, and just expose those dots. So you see those big oval shaped or circular pads? That's what we're gonna be using for our contacts and putting the adapter to. So this is almost done, and it's almost ready to go. So this is what it will end up looking like once you finish. Nice shiny surface is what we need to get, because if there is any acrylic between the pad and the solder, you're not going to be able to solder the device properly. 32 gigs, that's what it looks like once it's dried and ready for soldering.